The phone call came exactly 48 hours after we buried my father. I was sitting in his study, surrounded by boxes of photographs and old letters, trying to decide what to do with a lifetime of memories that no longer had a living owner. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds in dusty stripes. The house was quiet. In that hollow way places become when the person who filled them is suddenly gone. My phone buzzed against the desk. A number I did not recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was professional, almost apologetic. He introduced himself as Harold Patterson, my father's estate attorney. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said there was a matter we needed to discuss urgently. He said there had been a change to the will. I remember the exact moment the meaning of his words reached me. It felt like the room tilted slightly, like the floor beneath my chair had shifted an inch to the left. I asked him what kind of change. He paused. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear him breathing. Then he said a new will had been filed 11 days before my father passed. A will that superseded the document we had reviewed together 18 months earlier. A will that named my stepmother Diane as the sole beneficiary of everything. Everything. The house I had grown up in. The investment accounts my father had built over 40 years. The life insurance policy that was supposed to help me pay off my student loans. The small cabin in Vermont where we had spent every summer of my childhood. Everything was now Diane's. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to pause for a moment. Think about where you are. Maybe you are driving somewhere familiar, the road unfolding ahead of you without requiring attention. Maybe you are doing dishes while this plays in the background, your hands moving through warm water. Maybe you are lying in bed at the end of a long day, searching for a story that makes you feel less alone. I was sitting in my father's study, surrounded by his things, learning that I had been erased from his final wishes 11 days before he died. 11 days. He had been in hospice care by then, barely conscious, unable to speak more than a few words at a time. Tell me in the comments what you are doing while you listen, because even now, years later, it still amazes me how quickly everything can change when the people you trust decide you are worth betraying. To understand what happened next, I need to take you back to the beginning. Not to that phone call, but to the years that shaped everything before it. My name is Corinne Ashford. I grew up in a comfortable house in Richmond, Virginia, the only child of parents who seemed to love each other in the quiet, steady way that does not make for dramatic stories, but does make for a safe childhood. My mother was an elementary school teacher who smelled like chalk dust and lavender. My father was a financial advisor who came home every evening at 5:47, kissed my mother on the cheek, and asked me about my day like he genuinely wanted to know the answer. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable. More importantly, we were connected in ways I did not appreciate until much later. Sunday dinners, summer vacations, the kind of ordinary rituals that become precious only in retrospect. My mother died when I was 19, ovarian cancer caught too late, gone too quickly. 1 month she was helping me pack for my sophomore year of college, the next month she was in a hospital bed, and the month after that, she was gone. I remember the last conversation we had when she was fully herself. She held my hand and told me to take care of my father. She said he was strong in so many ways, but fragile in others. She said he needed someone to remind him that life was worth living. She said she trusted me to be that person. I promised her I would. It was the last promise I ever made to her. The grief hollowed out our house like termites working through wood. My father moved through rooms that no longer held her, touching objects she had touched, sitting in chairs where she used to sit. I watched him diminish slowly, like a photograph left in sunlight. The first year was the hardest. He barely ate. He stopped going to work for weeks at a time. He sat in her garden, even in the rain, as if waiting for her to come back and tend to the flowers she had planted. I worried constantly that I would lose him too. Not to illness, but to the weight of missing her. I transferred to a college closer to home. I came back every weekend to cook meals he would not eat, to clean rooms he had stopped noticing. I learned to manage his bills when he forgot. I learned to check on him at odd hours, because sometimes the grief got so heavy he could not breathe. Slowly, gradually, we found our way back to each other. Not to who we had been, but to something new. Sunday morning breakfasts became our ritual. Long walks in the evening became our therapy. We talked about her constantly, keeping her alive through stories and memories, refusing to let her disappear from our daily lives. For 3 years, it was just the two of us. We rebuilt something, not the family we had been, but something new. Something smaller and more fragile, but still real. Then Diane arrived. She was a colleague from his firm, recently divorced, polished, attentive in ways that made him feel seen again. She had an elegance that seemed natural until you looked closely and realized how carefully it was constructed, every hair in place, every outfit coordinated, every word chosen with precision. I watched their relationship develop with a mixture of hope and caution. He deserved happiness. He deserved companionship. After 3 years of watching him struggle, part of me was relieved to see him smile again, to see light return to eyes that had been dim for so long. But something about Diane never quite settled right in my chest. She laughed at his jokes a beat too quickly. She agreed with his opinions before he finished stating them. She made herself indispensable in small ways, cooking his favorite meals, remembering his schedule, anticipating his needs with an efficiency that felt more like strategy than affection. I tried to get to know her. I invited her to lunch, just the two of us, hoping to find common ground. She accepted graciously, but spent the entire meal redirecting the conversation away from herself. I learned nothing about her past, her family, her dreams or fears. She was a surface without depth, a performance without a person beneath it. When I mentioned my concerns to my father, gently, carefully, he dismissed them. He said I was being protective, which was natural. He said Diane was just reserved, which was understandable given her difficult divorce. He said I would warm to her in time. They married when I was 24. I stood beside my father at the small ceremony, smiling because he was smiling, hoping I was wrong about the feeling that had taken root in my stomach. I was not wrong. The years after Diane entered our lives were a slow erosion. Not dramatic, not obvious, but relentless in the way water wears down stone. She began with small suggestions. Perhaps I did not need to call quite so often. Perhaps my visits were disrupting their routine. Perhaps my father needed space to enjoy his new marriage without his daughter hovering constantly. The suggestions were always framed as concern for my father, never as criticism of me. She was protecting him, she implied. She was giving him room to heal, to grow, to build a new life. My presence, my calls, my visits were obstacles to that healing. My father, eager to make his new wife happy, agreed. Our weekly dinners became monthly. Our daily phone calls became weekly. The closeness we had rebuilt after my mother's death began to thin, stretched by distance, Diane carefully cultivated. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself she was just a woman trying to build a marriage. I told myself the changes were natural, expected, healthy even. But I noticed things. The way she redirected conversations when I asked about their finances. The way she mentioned expensive purchases, a new car, renovations to the house, trips to destinations my father had never shown interest in visiting. The way she bristled whenever I suggested spending time alone with my father. I noticed how his old friends stopped coming around. How his golf buddies from the club faded from his life. How the colleague he had known for 30 years suddenly stopped calling. Each absence was explained by Diane in reasonable terms. They had grown apart. Their interests had diverged. People change. But people do not change that completely, that quickly, that conveniently. When I graduated from law school at 27, my father attended the ceremony with Diane at his side. He hugged me and told me he was proud. But something in his eyes looked tired, almost apologetic, like he was carrying a weight he could not name. I started my career as a public defender in Richmond, close enough to visit, but far enough that Diane could not claim I was intruding. I carved out time to see my father when she was occupied elsewhere, catching glimpses of the man he used to be when she was not in the room to manage his responses. Those stolen visits became precious. We would sit in his study, the room Diane rarely entered, and talk the way we used to. He would tell me about his work, about memories of my mother, about regrets he carried. Sometimes he seemed almost like himself. Other times, there was a hesitation in his voice, a wariness, as if he was watching his words even with me. Over the next 8 years, I watched my father's health decline, first slowly, then with gathering speed. Diabetes that required careful management, heart problems that limited his activities, small strokes that left him confused and vulnerable. Each diagnosis pulled him further from independence and deeper into Diane's control. I offered to help. I offered to move home, to take a leave from work, to do whatever was necessary to support him through his illness. Diane refused every offer. She said she had it handled. She said outside help would only confuse him. She said I should focus on my career and trust her to manage his care. I did not trust her. But I did not know what to do about it. She was his wife. She had legal authority over his medical decisions. And my father, diminished by illness and dependence, no longer had the capacity to advocate for himself. I documented what I could. I saved messages, I noted inconsistencies, I created a file of concerns that grew thicker with each passing year. I did not know if I would ever need it. I only knew that something was wrong, and the only protection I could offer was keeping a record. The call came in early October. My father had collapsed at home. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was barely responsive. The doctors used words like inoperable and palliative care, and making him comfortable. They said he had weeks at most. I took emergency leave from work and drove to Richmond that night. When I arrived at the hospital, Diane was sitting in the waiting room. Her makeup perfect, her expression arranged into something that looked like grief, without actually touching it. She told me I should not have come. She said the doctors had everything under control. She said my presence would only upset him. I walked past her without responding and found my father's room. He was smaller than I remembered. The machines surrounding him beeped and hummed, measuring the slow failure of his body. His eyes were closed, but when I took his hand, they fluttered open. For one moment, one perfect moment, he looked at me the way he used to. Like I was his daughter. Like I mattered. He squeezed my hand weakly. His lips moved. I leaned closer to hear. He whispered that he was sorry. He whispered that things were not what they seemed. He whispered that I needed to be careful. Then his eyes closed again, and he drifted back into whatever twilight space the dying occupied between one world and the next. Those words haunted me in the weeks that followed. Things were not what they seemed. What things? What had he seen that he could not tell me? What had he discovered, too late, about the woman he had married? I stayed at the hospital every day for the next 3 weeks. I slept in the chair beside his bed. I held his hand during the long nights when his breathing grew ragged. I talked to him even when I was not sure he could hear, telling him stories from our past, reminding him of summers in Vermont, promising him I would be okay. Diane appeared for brief visits, always with someone else present. Always performing the role of devoted wife, without actually engaging in the work of it. She brought flowers that wilted. She made calls to people I did not know. She disappeared for hours at a time on errands she refused to explain. On the morning my father died, I was alone with him. The sun was just coming up, pale gold light filtering through the hospital window. His breathing had been shallow all night, each exhale a little longer than the last. I was holding his hand when he took his final breath. I was looking at his face when the tension left it, and he became, finally, still. The nurses came. The doctors came. Eventually, Diane came, arriving an hour after he passed, somehow already dressed for mourning. The funeral was 4 days later. I moved through it in a haze of exhaustion and grief. People said things to me that I do not remember. Diane stood at the front of the church accepting condolences like a queen receiving tribute. And then, 48 hours after we buried him, Harold Patterson called. I drove to his office the next morning. The building was downtown Richmond. All glass and polished stone, the kind of place that smelled like money and caution. Harold met me in a conference room with a view of the city skyline. He was older than I expected, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had practiced delivering difficult news many times. He offered me water, coffee, his condolences again. Then he opened a folder and slid a document across the table. I read it slowly, each word landing like a stone in my chest. The will was dated 11 days before my father's death. It was signed with his name in handwriting that looked almost like his, but not quite. The letters were shaky, uneven, the penmanship of a man whose hands could barely hold a pen. The document named Diane as sole beneficiary of all assets. It explicitly revoked any previous wills. It stated that this reflected my father's final wishes, made of his own free will and sound mind. Sound mind. The phrase echoed in my head as I stared at the signature. My father had been in hospice care by then. He had been on morphine, barely conscious, unable to recognize me. Some days. He had not had sound mind for weeks. I asked Harold how this was possible. I asked who had witnessed the signing. I asked why I was not informed. He looked uncomfortable. He said the witnesses were listed in the document. He said he had not been present for the signing. He said a colleague had handled the final paperwork while he was out of town. I asked which colleague. He named someone I had never heard of, a junior associate who had left the firm shortly after my father died. He said the timing had been unfortunate, but unrelated. I looked at the witness signatures. 2 names I did not recognize, but beneath them, in the space marked as present during execution, was a name I knew very well. Diane Ashford. I asked Harold if he thought the document was legitimate. He paused, choosing his words carefully. He said he was not in a position to make that determination. He said the document appeared to be properly executed. He said if I had concerns, I should consult with an attorney who specialized in estate litigation. The subtext was clear. He suspected something was wrong, but his professional obligations prevented him from saying so directly. I thanked him and left his office with a copy of both wills, the original and the new one. I sat in my car in the parking garage for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the documents, comparing the signatures, noting every inconsistency I could find. By the time I drove home, I had made a decision. I was not going to accept this quietly. I was not going to let Diane erase my father's true wishes because she had been positioned to take advantage of his final vulnerability. The next weeks were a blur of legal research and sleepless nights. I had spent 8 years as a public defender. I knew the law. I knew procedure. I knew what undue influence looked like and how difficult it was to prove. Virginia law required proving that the testator was subjected to improper pressure that overcame their free will. It required showing that the influence was operative at the time the will was executed. It required demonstrating a causation between the influence and the contents of the will. The burden of proof fell on the person challenging the will. On me, I pulled every resource I had. I called colleagues from law school who practiced estate law. I researched case precedents late into the night. I learned the statistics, how rarely these challenges succeeded, how expensive they were, how emotionally devastating the process could be. None of that deterred me. But I also knew what my father had wanted. He had shown me his original will 18 months earlier, the one he had created before his health declined. It named me as the primary beneficiary, with a modest provision for Diane that reflected their relatively brief marriage. He had explained his reasoning carefully. Diane had her own resources from her previous marriage and her career. He wanted to ensure I was taken care of, the way he and my mother had always planned. I remembered that conversation clearly. We had been sitting in his study, the same room where I would later receive the call from Harold Patterson. He had been worried about his health, about what would happen when he was gone. He had wanted me to understand his intentions so there would be no confusion. He had said, specifically and clearly, that Diane was entitled to the house and enough to live comfortably, but that the bulk of his assets should go to me. He had said that was what my mother would have wanted. He had said protecting me was his final responsibility as a parent. That will had been witnessed, notarized, and filed properly. It had been created when my father was fully competent, fully aware, fully in control of his decisions. The new will had been created when he was dying, confused, and entirely dependent on the woman who now controlled everything. I hired an attorney who specialized in estate litigation. Her name was Veronica Massoud, and she had a reputation for taking cases other lawyers refused to touch. Her success rate was remarkable, not because she won easy cases, but because she had a talent for finding the truth beneath carefully constructed lies. We met in her office, a cluttered space filled with files and photographs of grateful clients. The walls were covered with thank you notes and newspaper clippings about cases she had won. The space felt lived in, authentic, like a place where real work happened. Veronica was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair that she wore pulled back severely. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes, her expression giving nothing away. When I finished, she asked one question. Did I have any evidence that my father had expressed different wishes before the new will was created? I thought about it. I thought about the conversations we had had over the years, the things he had said during his final weeks, the whispered apology in the hospital room. Then I remembered something. A recording. During one of my hospital visits, about a week before he died, my father had been unusually lucid. We had talked for nearly an hour, longer than any conversation in months. He had spoken about my mother, about regrets, about things he wished he had done differently. And he had spoken about Diane. He said he was worried about her. Not worried for her. Worried about her. He said she had changed since his illness began. He said she was doing things behind his back that he could not quite track. He said he wanted to make sure I was protected. I had recorded part of that conversation on my phone. Not the whole thing, just a fragment. I had wanted to capture his voice while I still could. The selfish desire of a grieving daughter who knew she would soon have nothing left of him except memories and recordings. I had not realized I was also capturing evidence. I pulled out my phone and played the recording for Veronica. My father's voice filled the office, thin and tired but unmistakably his. He said my name. He said he loved me. He said he had made arrangements to take care of me. He said Diane did not know about all of them. He said some things were hidden where she would never think to look. Veronica leaned forward as the recording played. When it ended, she sat back with an expression I could not quite read. She said we might have a case. She said it would be difficult, expensive, and uncertain. She said Diane would fight back with every resource she now controlled. She asked if I was prepared for that. I told her I had spent 3 weeks watching my father die. I told her I had held his hand while he took his last breath. I told her I was not going to let the woman who isolated him in his final years erase him entirely. I was prepared. The lawsuit was filed in January, 3 months after my father's death. We alleged that the new will was the product of undue influence, that my father had lacked the mental capacity to execute valid legal documents in his final days, and that Diane had manipulated him for financial gain. Filing the lawsuit was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made. It meant exposing my family's private business to public scrutiny. It meant confronting a woman who had resources and motivation to destroy me. It meant reliving the worst months of my life over and over again, through depositions and testimony. But I also knew that staying silent meant letting Diane win. It meant allowing her to erase my father's true wishes. It meant accepting a theft dressed up as inheritance. I could not accept that. Diane's response was immediate and vicious. Her attorney, a sharp-featured man named Richard Corbett, filed a counter-motion accusing me of elder interference. He claimed I had attempted to alienate my father from his wife during his illness. He claimed I had been estranged from my father for years and was now trying to claim an inheritance I did not deserve. The allegations were lies. But they were lies with enough shape to make people pause. Lies crafted to shift the narrative, to make me the villain, rather than the victim. Richard Corbett was known for aggressive tactics, for winning not through truth, but through exhaustion and intimidation. Veronica warned me that the process would be brutal. She said Diane would try to make it personal, try to make me quit, try to make the cost of fighting higher than the cost of accepting defeat. I told her I understood. I told her I was not going anywhere. The discovery process began. Subpoenas were issued, documents were requested, Diane's financial records, my father's medical records, communications between all parties during the final months of his life. The process took months. Richard Corbett fought every request, filing objections and motions to quash. He claimed the requests were overbroad, invasive, designed to harass his client. Judge Harmon, who had been assigned to the case, overruled most of his objections, but the delays accumulated, stretching weeks into months. What emerged was a picture more disturbing than I had imagined. Diane had been systematically isolating my father for years. Emails showed her discouraging visits from his friends. Text messages revealed her complaints about my calls and visits. Financial records documented a steady transfer of assets into accounts she controlled alone. There was a pattern in the financial transfers that Veronica's forensic accountant identified. Small amounts at first, explained as household expenses. Then larger amounts, rationalized as investments or repairs. By the time my father entered hospice care, nearly $200,000 had been moved from joint accounts into Diane's personal accounts. Money that should have been part of his estate. Money that she had positioned herself to keep. More damaging still were the medical records from his final weeks. The hospice nurses had noted that my father was frequently confused, unable to recognize people, unable to sustain conversation for more than a few minutes. One nurse had written, "Patient unable to communicate coherent wishes. Family decision-making recommended." That note was dated 2 days before the new will was signed. There was also documentation of a concerning pattern around the signing itself. No independent attorney had been present. No physician had certified my father's competence. The only people in the room were Diane, the 2 witnesses, and my father, who according to medical records could barely remember what day it was. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. One of the witnesses to the new will, a woman named Carol Hendricks, contacted Veronica directly. She said she had been troubled by what she saw that day. She said my father had seemed disoriented during the signing. She said Diane had guided his hand to form the signature. She said she had been told it was a routine document. Nothing important, just some paperwork that needed handling. Carol was a home health aide who had worked for Diane on a few occasions. She had been called to the house that day, she said, under the pretense of helping with my father's care. When she arrived, she was asked to witness a document instead. She said she had not known what she was witnessing until much later, when she heard about the lawsuit and recognized the date. She said the guilt had been eating at her for months. She said she could not stay silent anymore. Carol Hendricks was willing to testify. Her willingness changed everything. A witness from inside the room, describing what actually happened, contradicting Diane's carefully constructed narrative. It was the kind of evidence that could turn a difficult case into a winnable one. The hearing was scheduled for June. 6 months of preparation, depositions, motions, and countermotions had led to this moment. We gathered in a courtroom in downtown Richmond, the same city where I had grown up, where my mother had taught, where my father had built his career. Diane sat at the defendant's table. Her expression composed, her posture straight. She had dressed carefully, conservative but expensive, projecting the image of a grieving widow facing unfair accusations. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Veronica, my hands folded in my lap, trying to project a calm I did not feel. The judge was a woman named Elizabeth Harmon. She had a reputation for thoroughness, for following evidence wherever it led, for having little patience with manipulation or performance. The courtroom gallery was nearly empty. This was not a case that attracted public attention, just a family dispute over money and property, the kind of thing that happened every day in courts across the country. But for me, it was everything. My father's memory, my mother's legacy, my own sense of justice. The proceedings began with opening statements. Richard Corbett painted a picture of a devoted wife who had cared for her dying husband, only to face accusations from an estranged daughter motivated by greed. He spoke eloquently about the burden Diane had carried, nursing my father through his final illness, managing his affairs when he could not, protecting him from a daughter who had abandoned him years before. Veronica painted a different picture, one of systematic isolation, financial manipulation, and a forged will created when the testator could not even recognize his own family. She laid out the timeline, the evidence, the witnesses who would testify to what they had seen and heard. She spoke quietly but firmly, letting the facts carry the weight of her argument. Then the evidence was presented. The medical records came first. Veronica walked the court through the documentation, highlighting the entries that showed my father's declining capacity. She showed the dates, the nurse's notes, the medication logs that demonstrated he was heavily sedated during the period when the new will was allegedly signed. She presented the timeline visually, a chart showing my father's documented mental state alongside the date of the will signing. The contrast was stark. On one side, medical professionals documenting confusion and incapacity. On the other side, a legal document claiming sound mind and free will. Then Carol Hendricks took the stand. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. But her testimony was clear and devastating. She described being asked by Diane to witness a document signing. She described arriving at the house to find my father in bed, barely responsive. She described Diane physically guiding his hand to create the signature. She described being told afterward that everything was routine, that there was nothing to worry about. Richard Corbett tried to discredit her on cross-examination. He suggested she had been coached. He implied she had her own grievances against Diane. He questioned her memory, her motives, her reliability. Carol did not waver. She answered each question directly, consistently, without embellishment. She said she had come forward because what she witnessed was wrong, and she could not live with staying silent. Then came the recording. Veronica had fought hard to have my phone recording admitted as evidence. Diane's attorneys had argued it was hearsay, illegally obtained, prejudicial. The judge had ruled it admissible as a statement by the deceased that went to his state of mind and intentions. The courtroom went silent as my father's voice filled the space. Thin, tired, but unmistakably him. He spoke about his worries. He spoke about Diane's behavior. He spoke about wanting to protect me. Then he said something I had not fully understood when I first recorded it. He said there was a safety deposit box. He said it was at the bank where he had opened my first savings account when I was 7 years old. He said the key was hidden in his desk, taped to the back of the drawer where he kept my mother's letters. He said the box contained documents Diane did not know about. He said it was his insurance policy. He said he hoped I would never need it, but if I did, everything I needed would be there. I had found the key the night before the hearing. I had gone to the bank that morning. I had opened the box. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting, dated 8 months before his death, back when his mind was still clear. It explained everything. The concerns he had about Diane. The steps he had taken to protect his assets. The original will, which he had never intended to change. There was also a notarized affidavit, witnessed by 2 colleagues from his firm, stating that any will created after his diagnosis should be considered invalid, unless he was examined by an independent physician and found competent. The documents were admitted into evidence over Richard Corbett's strenuous objections. Judge Harmon reviewed them carefully. The courtroom waited in tense silence. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable. She asked Diane to take the stand. Diane walked to the witness chair with measured steps, her composure still intact. She was sworn in. Veronica began the cross-examination. The questions started simply. When had Diane first learned about the original will? Had she discussed estate planning with my father? Had she been present when the new will was signed? Diane answered smoothly, her responses rehearsed and polished. Yes, she had known about the original will. No, she had not pressured her husband to change it. She had simply been present to support him during a difficult time. Then Veronica showed her the affidavit. Diane's composure cracked for the first time. Her eyes widened slightly. Her lips pressed together. She asked where the document had come from. Veronica explained that it had been found in a safety deposit box, one that Diane apparently had not known about. Diane's attorney objected. Judge Harmon overruled. Veronica continued. She asked Diane if she had known about the affidavit. Diane said no. She asked if Diane had known about her husband's concerns regarding her behavior. Diane said no. She asked if Diane had physically guided my father's hand during the signing of the new will. Diane hesitated. For one long moment, the courtroom was completely silent. Then she said she had only been steadying his hand. She said he had wanted to sign. She was just helping him do what he wanted to do. Veronica asked how she knew what he wanted when the nurses had documented that he could not communicate coherent wishes. Diane had no answer. Veronica pressed further. She asked about the isolation. She asked about the years of steering my father away from his friends, his colleagues, his daughter. She asked about the financial transfers that had occurred during his illness. Money moving from joint accounts into accounts Diane controlled alone. Diane's composure began to crack. Her answers became defensive, contradictory. She said she had been protecting him. She said she had been managing his affairs because he could not. She said everything she did was for his benefit. Veronica presented bank statements showing large purchases, jewelry, designer items, vacation bookings, all made during the months my father was dying. She asked if these purchases were for his benefit. Diane did not answer. Richard Corbett objected repeatedly, trying to protect his client from further damage, but the evidence was already in the record. The jury of facts had already seen enough. When Diane was finally allowed to step down from the witness stand, she walked back to her seat with none of the grace she had entered the courtroom with. She looked diminished, exposed, like someone who had been caught in a lie too large to explain away. Judge Harmon took 3 weeks to issue her ruling. 3 weeks of waiting, of barely sleeping, of wondering whether the evidence would be enough. I tried to maintain my normal routine during that time. I went to work, I met with clients, I handled cases that required my attention, but my mind was never fully present. Part of me was always back in that courtroom, replaying testimony, reviewing evidence, wondering what the judge was thinking as she weighed everything we had presented. Veronica checked in with me regularly. She said the waiting was always the hardest part. She said the strength of our case gave her confidence. She said judges like Elizabeth Harmon did not rule lightly, and her thoroughness was usually a good sign. I tried to believe her. Some days I succeeded. Most days, I did not. The decision came on a Tuesday afternoon. I drove to the courthouse with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The summer heat shimmered off the pavement. The air conditioning in my car could not seem to compete with the warmth that had settled into every surface. Veronica met me in the hallway outside the courtroom. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes that gave me hope. She squeezed my arm briefly and said we would know soon. Diane was already inside when we entered. She sat at the defendant's table with Richard Corbett, her posture stiff, her face carefully composed. She did not look at me as I took my seat. Judge Harmon entered, and we all rose. The ritual of it felt almost absurd, given what was at stake. But rituals exist for a reason. They provide structure when everything else feels uncertain. The judge's ruling was thorough. She began by summarizing the facts of the case, the timeline, the evidence presented by both sides. She spoke for nearly an hour, her voice measured and precise. She reviewed the medical records in detail, noting the documented decline in my father's cognitive function during his final months. She noted the specific entries from hospice nurses, describing his confusion, his inability to recognize visitors, his incapacity for sustained communication. She reviewed Carol Hendrick's testimony, finding it credible and consistent. She noted that Carol had no personal stake in the outcome, no connection to either party, beyond her unfortunate involvement in witnessing the document. She reviewed the recording of my father's voice, finding it admissible and relevant to establishing his state of mind. She noted that the recording demonstrated both his awareness that something was wrong and his desire to protect me. She reviewed the affidavit from the safety deposit box, finding it a powerful indicator of my father's true intentions. She noted that the affidavit had been created when he was unquestionably competent, witnessed by colleagues who knew him well, and preserved in a location specifically chosen to prevent Diane from discovering it. Then she delivered her conclusions. She found that my father had lacked the mental capacity to execute a valid will during his final days. The medical evidence was overwhelming. The timing was suspicious. The circumstances were irregular in ways that could not be explained by innocent coincidence. She found that Diane had exercised undue influence over him during a period of extreme vulnerability. The pattern of isolation, the financial manipulation, the rushed execution of a new will during hospice care, all pointed to a deliberate effort to redirect his assets. She found that the new will was invalid. The original will was restored. The house, the investments, the insurance policy, the cabin in Vermont, they were mine again. What my father had intended what my mother would have wanted. What I had almost lost to a woman who had spent years positioning herself for exactly this moment. Diane did not look at me as the ruling was read. She stared straight ahead, her composure finally and completely shattered. Her attorney whispered something to her, but she did not respond. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. I felt tears streaming down my face, but I did not wipe them away. I let them fall. They were not tears of joy exactly. They were something more complicated. Relief. Grief. The strange emptiness that comes when a battle finally ends and you realize how much of yourself you poured into fighting it. Veronica touched my shoulder gently. She said we had won. She said my father would be proud. I walked out of the courthouse into bright summer sunlight. The heat wrapped around me like an embrace. I stood on the steps and breathed deeply, feeling something that had been clenched inside my chest for months finally begin to release. I called my father's oldest friend, a man named Walter, who had known him since college. I told him what had happened. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said he had always known something was wrong with Diane. He said he had tried to warn my father years ago. He said he was glad the truth had finally come out. I thanked him and ended the call. I stood on those courthouse steps for a long time, watching people come and go, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the small victory that had just been won in the building behind them. It has been 2 years since that ruling. 2 years of rebuilding, of processing, of learning how to move forward when the ground beneath you has shifted so dramatically. The months immediately after the verdict were complicated. There were practical matters to handle, transferring accounts, managing properties, settling the estate properly. There were emotional matters too. The grief I had postponed during the legal battle finally demanding its due. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in complicated grief and family trauma. Her name was Dr. Elaine Prescott, and she helped me understand that what I had experienced was a kind of double loss. I had lost my father to illness, and then I had almost lost my memory of him to someone who wanted to rewrite his final chapter. Dr. Prescott helped me process the anger I felt toward Diane, the guilt I felt for not recognizing sooner what was happening, the sadness that lingered beneath everything else. She helped me understand that protecting myself and my father's legacy was not selfish. It was an act of love. I sold the house in Richmond. I could not live there, not with all those memories tangled up with the knowledge of what Diane had tried to do. The buyers were a young family with 2 children, people who would fill those rooms with new laughter and new memories. That felt right. But I kept the cabin in Vermont. I go there every summer now, the way my family used to when my mother was alive. I sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains and feel connected to something larger than the pain of recent years. I made improvements to the cabin, repairs my father had been meaning to get to for years. I replaced the old roof. I refinished the floors. I planted a garden in the clearing beside the house, the same spot where my mother used to grow tomatoes. My father's ashes are scattered there, beside my mother's. They are together again, in the place where we were happiest. I visit them whenever I can, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, talking to them about my life, telling them things I wish I had said when they could still hear me. Diane disappeared after the ruling. I heard through former colleagues of my father's that she moved out of state, that her reputation in Richmond was destroyed, that she had faced professional consequences I know nothing about. Some people said she moved to Florida, others said she remarried quickly, finding another target for her particular skills. I do not follow her story. I do not need to know what became of her. She is no longer part of my life. And that separation is final in ways that court rulings cannot fully capture. What I needed was to protect what my father built. What I needed was to honor what my mother would have wanted. What I needed was to refuse to be erased by someone who saw my family as resources to be exploited. I accomplished all of those things, and in doing so I found something I had not expected. Peace. Not the dramatic kind that arrives with fanfare. The quiet kind that settles over you gradually, like morning light filling a room. If you are listening to this and something inside you feels tight with recognition, I want you to know that your experience is valid. Family is supposed to protect us, not prey upon us. The people who claim to love us are supposed to honor our wishes, not manipulate them for personal gain. But some people do not work that way. Some people see vulnerability as opportunity. Some people spend years positioning themselves for the moment when they can take everything. You are not paranoid for noticing the signs. You are not ungrateful for questioning their motives. You are not wrong for fighting back when they try to erase you. I watched my father die. I held his hand as he took his final breath, and then I discovered that the woman he had trusted was trying to steal everything he had built. But I had evidence, I had documentation, I had a recording I almost did not think to make, I had a safety deposit box I almost did not know to look for. The truth was there, waiting to be found. I just had to be willing to look. Thank you for listening to my story. Tell me in the comments where you are, what brought you here, what battles you are fighting or have fought. If you have ever watched someone you love become vulnerable and felt powerless to protect them, remember this. Documentation matters. Evidence matters. The small acts of recording, of saving, of noting what seems wrong, they matter more than you know. Pay attention to the warning signs. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Do not let anyone convince you that your concerns are paranoia. Sometimes the people who seem most devoted are the most dangerous. Sometimes the ones who promise to take care of your loved ones are the ones positioning themselves to take everything. Silence can protect the wrong people. Truth can restore what was stolen. And sometimes the loudest act of love is refusing to let someone erase the person you have lost. My father tried to protect me even as he was dying. He left me breadcrumbs because he knew something was wrong, even when he could not fight it himself. He trusted me to find them. I found them, and I fought. If you are facing something similar, I hope you find your breadcrumbs too. I hope you have the strength to fight. And I hope you know that protecting yourself is not selfishness. It is survival. It is love. It is exactly what the people who truly loved you would want you to do. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Revenge Stories Lab, like this video and hit that notification button so more people can hear it. If you have ever been told you were imagining things, that your concerns were unfounded, that you should trust people who did not deserve your trust, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge.